On March 5, 1770, a mob of angry colonists and British soldiers clash in the Boston Massacre. But what triggered this important event in U.S. history? And what happened to the soldiers who fired on the crowd? Britain, with the help of its 13 colonies and Native American allies, won the French and Indian War in 1763, known worldwide as the 7 Years' War. Britain incurred massive debts to gain this victory and expected the colonies to pay their share. However, the colonists lacked representation in Parliament. British redcoats were sent to Boston to enforce the Townshend Acts, which taxed glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, and established new customs officials to collect those import taxes. On the cold night of March 5, 1770, a mob of 200 men, many of them dock workers, gathered outside the customs house on King Street near Boston's Old State House. Many in the mob were armed with clubs, ice chunks, rocks, and oyster shells. The men berated the lone sentry, Private Hugh White, who called for the main guard, led by Captain Thomas Preston. A man struck Private Hugh Montgomery with a club, which led some of the soldiers to fire on the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead or dying, including Crispus Attucks, a free black man. Patriot silversmith Paul Revere produced a provocative engraving that portrayed the soldiers as murderous and the crowd as innocent. Copies were distributed throughout the colonies, sparking outrage against Britain. Months after the Boston Massacre, the 8 regular soldiers and Captain Preston were put on trial in Boston for murder. A guilty verdict would mean execution. There were 2 trials, with Captain Preston tried separately from his men. John Hancock and Samuel Adams, patriot leaders of the Sons of Liberty, successfully kept the people's outrage brimming during the months leading up to the trial. Future Continental Congress delegate Robert Treat Paine served as lead prosecuting attorney. Captain Preston and his enlisted men claimed self-defense, and Preston doubted that a fair trial in Boston would be possible. The lead defense attorney, future U.S. President John Adams, sought to prove otherwise. John Adams, like his cousin Samuel Adams, was an avowed patriot, but he feared his defense of these redcoats would ruin both his reputation and that of his children. Adams's relentless pursuit of truth and his unwavering belief in the right to a fair trial drove him. Preston's trial began on October 24, 1770, and his men's about a month later. Each of the trials lasted about a week. The redcoats had been jailed for the months leading up to the trials. Adams used his litigation skills to successfully impanel a jury of men who lived in towns outside of Boston proper, increasing the chances of impartiality. He called witnesses who testified that Captain Preston stood in front of his men rather than behind them, as inaccurately portrayed in Paul Revere's now famous engraving. This sowed doubt that Preston would have given an order to fire. Witnesses also revealed that the large crowd threw clubs, ice chunks, rocks, and oyster shells at the redcoats, and that some taunted the soldiers, daring them to fire. Adams directly challenged the indictment, which charged premeditation using the words malice aforethought. He argued that a reasonable man, even a trained soldier armed with a musket, would fear for his life in such a circumstance. Keep in mind that it would take a highly trained British soldier about 30 seconds to reload his musket. These redcoats faced a mob of some 200 men, many of them emboldened with liquid courage. In the end, Captain Preston and his men were acquitted of the murder charge. 2 of the soldiers, including Private Hugh Montgomery, who fired the first shot, and another soldier named Matthew Kilroy, were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Those 2 were given no additional jail time and were sentenced only with an M branded on their thumbs. In a time when no true form of ID existed, this was meant to ensure that any future trouble with the law would not result in another light sentence. John Adams went on to become one of the most important founding fathers. He played a vital role at the Continental Congress, where he, more than any other delegate, convinced the Congress to declare independence. It was Adams who suggested that Thomas Jefferson write the initial draft of the Declaration of Independence and, along with Benjamin Franklin, helped edit that draft. Renowned American historian David McCullough referred to Adams as the voice of the Revolution. Adams traveled to Europe during the American Revolutionary War as a diplomat. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris that officially ended the war. After the war, he became the first U.S. ambassador to Britain. He served as the first U.S. vice president and the second U.S. president. Even with all his many accomplishments, Adams claimed that one of the best pieces of service he ever gave his country was his defense of the Boston Massacre soldiers. He wrote, quote, "Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been a foul stain upon this country." End quote. Mrs. Lewis and I had the chance to visit John Adams' home, known as Peacefield, in Quincy, or as the locals say, Quincy, Massachusetts. The home stayed in the family for generations and looks today much the way it did 200 years ago. You can also find 2 other homes where the Adamses lived in the area, including the one where he was born. Nearby, you can find his and Abigail's graves in the crypt of the United First Parish Church. The graves of their son, John Quincy Adams, the 6th U.S. president, and his wife, Louisa Catherine, are in that same crypt. I highly recommend a visit to Quincy when in the Boston area. To learn more about John Adams, I would suggest the 2008 HBO miniseries John Adams, starring Paul Giamatti as Adams and Laura Linney as his wife Abigail. It is superbly done. Naturally, the show takes some liberties, but it does an overall outstanding job of portraying the life and times of this important founding father. The first episode is my favorite, and it centers around the Boston Massacre trial. I use excerpts from it in class with my students each year as we learn about the American Revolution. If you are a reader, I recommend the 2001 Pulitzer Prize-winning book John Adams by David McCullough. The HBO miniseries is adapted from this book. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1671, Welsh buccaneer Henry Morgan sacks the rich Spanish city of Panama on the Pacific coast. In 1776, the British Army in Boston awakens to colonial cannons overlooking the city on Dorchester Heights. In 1946, Winston Churchill gives his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri. In 1953, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, leader since 1924, dies of a cerebral hemorrhage at age 74. Also in 1953, U.S. Air Force radio man Johnny Cash intercepts a Soviet message announcing Stalin's death. In 2002, The Osbournes premieres on MTV, chronicling the domestic life of metal singer Ozzy Osbourne. In 2021, Pope Francis arrives in Iraq for a 3-day visit with both Christian and Muslim leaders. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. What is Renaissance artist Michelangelo's surname? Bertolami? Buonarroti? Caprese? Or Carrera? Liked learning about the Boston Massacre? Then you'll love this one about the fog, yes, the fog, that saved George Washington. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.